So for most of my life, I hated giving presentations. As a kid, as a teen, as a university student, I was always really, really scared and nervous um, giving talks in front of people, and I tried to avoid giving talks as much as I could. Because whenever I did have to do one, I'd basically be a bunch of nerves for the entire week before. And often because of my nerves, the presentation really wouldn't turn out that great. At the time, I really thought it was something that I'd never really be able to do well. And I really didn't think it was something I'd ever enjoy doing. Just skip forward to now, and I give presentations on a quite regular basis. And surprisingly, I nowadays really, really actually enjoy giving talks. So hi, I'm Belinda Seckington. I work for a company called FutureLearn, and we're basically a social learning platform. So we partner with universities and cultural institutions all over the world to offer free online courses. So I've been there for about 4 years now, and my role kind of covers a couple of different things. So I'm now a technical manager, which means I manage developers and I help them with their career progression and basically becoming better developers. I'm also the evangelism lead, so encouraging our teams to get them to share what they do and what they've learned, not just within the company, but also outside of the company. And then outside of work, I also do events. So for the past 9 years, I've been organizing events through Geeks of London, and most of them have a focus again on getting more people to teach and share what they do with others. And then finally, I'm also a speaker and a blogger, where I try to share and teach people what it is that I know and do. And a lot of that requires presenting and speaking in front of people. So I wanted to talk a bit about, how did I get to where I am now? So how did I get over my fears and nerves regarding public speaking? So for me, the secret the magical solution came from preparation. So I find that whenever I try to learn something, it becomes easier for me if I understand all the different aspects, all the different building blocks of what it is that I'm trying to learn. So with presentations, it was basically about understanding my emotions and how my face and body and voice were reacting when I got nervous. It was about understanding how to tell compelling stories and how to keep the audience engaged. And it was about discovering how often I know that I need to practice until I feel completely comfortable with what it is that I'm trying to say. And finally, it was about understanding how to use the tools that I have in the most effective way. And alongside our voice and our words, our slides are basically the most important instruments in our presenters toolbox. And we basically should try to learn them as effectively as, we should learn to use them as effectively as we can. So that's pretty much what this talk is about, how to create effective slides. So what does that mean? What makes your slides effective? So let's take a step back and look at why are we presenting in the first place? So what's the goal of a presentation? So at first glance, you might think, every presentation is different. Some will be about teaching a new skill or a new knowledge. Some will be to convince people to use a specific product. Some will be to inspire and motivate people to change or do something. So there are endless kind of goals of what a presentation is for, and no two presentations will really be the same. But at the heart of it, they all have one thing in common. No matter what your motivation behind the presentation is, your number one goal as a presenter is to allow your audience to absorb your information. So whether you're trying to teach, convince, motivate, frighten, sell, or inspire, it's basically your responsibility to make that easier for your audience. And this all ties in with the concept of cognitive load. So this is the amount of mental activity required to accomplish a goal. So mental activity being things like perception, memory, problem solving, so things that make you actually think. So this definition comes from this book, Universal Principles of Design, and I'll be referring to it quite a couple of times during this presentation. It's a really, really good book covering 125 design principles, and it ties it all back to psychology and physiology research. So in that book, we also find this quote about cognitive load. So design should minimize cognitive load to the greatest degree possible. So when we talk about effective slides, we basically mean slides that help reduce that cognitive load. Slides that help rather than prevent people from consuming your information. So how do you do that? How do you create effective slides? How do you create slides that are compelling and help your audience? So I think the answer lies in shifting that question to how do you design effective slides? So we can get a better understanding of slide design by looking at design theory. So what I want to do today is share 4 principles of slide design so that you can create more compelling slides and help your audience absorb the information that you're trying to present. So one thing to bear in mind here is that I don't really believe there's one true way of creating slides. So this isn't about getting you all to create the same type of slides that I do. Rather, it's helping you all to get a basic understanding of design theory and then applying that to your own styles and themes and designs. So jumping straight in, principle number 1 is maximize signal, minimize noise. So this principle comes from the theory of signal to noise ratio. So this is the concept that in every type of communication we have, there is a certain amount of relevant information to us, the signal, and there's a certain amount of irrelevant information to us, which is the noise. And with good designs, we want to maximize the signal and minimize the noise. So ending up with mainly relevant information rather than irrelevant information. So how do we maximize signal and minimize noise in our slide designs? So how to make sure that the information on our slides is mainly relevant rather than irrelevant. So I think there are a couple of things that we can do to achieve this, but I won't necessarily be talking about all the different ideas. So just keep that in the back of your mind. So the first is focus on one purpose per slide. So this is about maximizing the signal. So the moment a slide has multiple purposes, it dilutes the relevant information that you're trying to get across. So rather than having a single slide covering multiple ideas or concepts, basically split them out over several slides. So this is about making sure that your slide is as relevant as possible to what you are saying at that point of time. So one thing I see happen a lot is using bullet points on one slide to cover multiple ideas. So take this example about cat facts. So if you're going to be talking for a few minutes about the history of house cats, and then a couple of minutes about why cats sleep 75% of their lives, and then a few minutes about each of those other points, you're basically diluting the signal of each point that you're trying to make. Because while you are talking about the history of cats, your audience is reading and thinking about all the other things that are on your slide already, and they won't be listening to you. So it's much better to split out those ideas over multiple slides. Allow your audience to focus on the one thing that you're trying to get across, the most relevant information for the audience at that point of time. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't be using bullet points at all, but use them to support the specific purpose of your slide. So for instance, in this case, the bullet points are used to list a set of names that belong together. All the information together is what makes it relevant. Another exception is when you're using it to recap or give an overview of all the things that you said earlier. So this slide has the same content as we saw before, but in this scenario, you've covered each of the points separately already. So the purpose is to show stuff that you've covered before in one single slide. So the audience doesn't have to focus as much on the individual points anymore, because none of it is new information. They've each been dealt with separately already. So context around this matters a lot. Think about what's the main thing that you're trying to get across. The second thing that we want to do is make sure that our slides aren't distracting. So in this case, you're trying to minimize noise, ensuring we don't have any irrelevant information. So one way of being distracting is having just way too much text on your slide. So the moment you have a slide like this, people stop listening to you because they're either distracted by trying to read all the stuff that's on there, or they get distracted trying to read and listen to you at the same time. So one thing to think about here is, did you actually listen to what I just said, or did you all just try to read the text that was on there? So rather than allowing your audience to focus on what you're saying by having that much text, you're basically kicking off all these other different questions and thoughts. So again, think about what information really matters and distill it down to just the very essential. Everything else is noise. And a variation of this is having too much code on a slide. So most of the time, you really don't need all of it. Instead, focus on the part that actually matters, again, to the audience at that time. So don't force them to try to read all of it, because you're only creating a situation for people to zone out and not listen to you. Another way slides can be distracting is when there's just way too much going on in them. So this is an extreme example, but I often feel that people want to use all the space that they have on a slide, making things super busy and much, much harder to process. So keep your slides simple and clean so that they're not visually distracting. So this shows exactly the same images as before, but because they're not overlapping and because there's no text laid over it, it's much easier for the audience to process. You're lowering that cognitive load that people need to use to absorb the information that you're trying to get across. So to recap, you can maximize signal by focusing on one purpose per slide, and you can minimize noise by reducing distractions on your slide. So principle number 2, make important information stand out. So again, let's go back to some theory. So the von Restorff effect is a phenomenon where you're more likely to remember things that are noticeably different than things that are common. So this is about making things look more unique or distinctive so that it stands out more and that people will remember them. So this is basically what the definition of contrast is: the state of being strikingly different from something from something else in juxtaposition or close association. So what we want is to use contrast in our slides to make things memorable. And a good example of using contrast comes from this book from Nancy Duarte, which is all about how to make good presentations. And it's a really good book to check out if you're trying to get better at this type of stuff. So in the book, she explains contrast through this visualization, kind of highlighting how we can use contrasts in our slides in a couple of different ways. So using color, shape, size, shade, and proximity. And in each of these examples, you're automatically drawn to the element that stands out. And I'll cover only 3 of them here specifically and give examples for them. Because I think shade is kind of a variation of color, and proximity isn't as easy to apply as the others. I think the others are much, much stronger. So I'll give examples for each of these 3 areas. So starting with color. So first step is choose a color palette with contrasting colors. So in the case of color, contrasting doesn't necessarily have to mean exact opposites. It's more about having colors that work well together and are different enough from each other that you can see that they are noticeably different. So I won't go into too much detail here about color theory, because there are plenty of websites and books out there that already cover this type of stuff. One of them that I really like, though, is this one called Color Supply with freewise.com. And it basically allows you to quickly try out various color combinations and shows different variations of it. And I think it also links to quite some good articles about color theory and kind of, explaining some of the more theory behind it. So it's a good place to start if you want to get some more color palettes. Another thing it also does is it actually shows you how the colors look like together in icons and patterns. So you can get a much better sense of what type of contrast you might be able to get in your slides. So one way of using color contrast is to use it within a slide to highlight the most important phrase or piece of data. So going a bit meta, you'll have noticed that most of my slides in this presentation have been following exactly this type of pattern. So blue background, white text, and then yellow text to highlight whatever is the most important information. As I mentioned before, the colors don't need to be too opposite each other. You can still use the same color, but then have different variations of it. So in this case, you have green, and you achieve contrast from those different variations of green. Besides using contrast within slides, you can also look at contrast between slides. So if you use Keynote, this is the light table view, and you basically get an overview of all your slides. I tend to use it quite a lot just to get a sense of how does my overall slide design look like. So this is an overview for you of one of the presentations I did last year about lessons that we can learn from the Marvel superheroes. And I each time used a red slide at the start of a section to highlight that we were switching to a different superhero. And because all the other slides are white, the red title stands out much, much more and makes people stop and pay attention, and highlights to them that we're going over to another section. Again, reducing that cognitive load. So second way to use contrast is shape. Now, traditionally, when you think of shapes like in that example, circles, squares, triangles, stuff like that. And while they can be used within your slides for contrast, those aren't actually the shapes that we most rely on in our presentations. What we rely on a lot are fonts. So one way of achieving contrast is through using different types of fonts within your presentation. So I tend to use custom fonts because the fonts that are built into our systems are mostly designed for reading paragraphs of text, and also people are more familiar with them. So it won't necessarily stand out as much as it could as when you're using something a bit more unique. So which fonts you end up using, it's quite a personal choice, and it will depend on your presentation style, what type of feeling you want your slides to exhibit. If you don't want to spend anything though, the first place to look for free fonts is Google Fonts. So the main focus of the collection is in providing the fonts as web fonts, but for all of the ones that are available, you can just download them and use them in most slide editors. If you're willing to pay for fonts, I suggest taking a look at the bundles on these websites, because rather than buying a single font, you basically buy a bundle of different fonts, and they often quite include a large and interesting selection. And if you subscribe to them, you can get updates about free fonts as well, and you can slowly kind of figure out what type of fonts it is that you like using in your presentations. So once you have your multiple fonts, you can start playing around with them to create contrast. So I'll show a couple of examples, but again, this is by no means the only way that you can create contrast with fonts. So in this first example, we are using different fonts within the same phrase or sentence. So the contrast is used to highlight specific words. The second way is using different fonts for different elements on the slide. So it's about making it easy for the audience to understand the different purposes of those elements. So for example, if all of the text was just in the same font, it just makes it way too confusing to read and much more difficult to comprehend. So using those different fonts really helps reduce that cognitive load again. The same is true for when you're displaying code. So if you've got multiple elements on your slide with different purposes, you use contrast to show that they are different. So don't make your users, your audience, think too much. So third way to use contrast is size. So the simplest way of using size for contrast is just grabbing a single element and making it bigger. So using it to make a statement about something. Or you can play around and make each part of the sentence a different size. So again, you'll notice that's what I tend to use a lot within my own slides. What becomes really interesting though is when you start pairing different fonts with different sizes. It basically means that you can really play around with making a slide look quite graphic. And these type of slides will stand out much more and make it more compelling to people. In these cases, the contrast is both within the slide and outside of the slide, making the slide more memorable in general. So those are 3 ways that you can use contrast to highlight key information and make it more memorable for your audience. So through color, shape, and size. So principle number 3, show and tell. So this principle comes from the picture superiority effect, which states that information recall is better when combining text and images. So rather than relying on purely text alone, we should be using visuals to support what we are saying. So people remember things better if they're absorbing that info both in text and in a visual way. So I want to talk about 4 different ways of adding visuals to your presentations. So first, photos. Photos are the easiest way of adding visuals to your slides. It makes them more lively and memorable. The thing with photos, and actually also with GIFs, is that they do need to be relevant to what you are saying. So keep principle number 1 again in mind. So maximize signal, minimize noise. So the moment that photos or GIFs aren't relevant, or if the connection is too tenuous, the photo only becomes noise. One other thing to mention here also is that as funny as some photos and GIFs are, not everyone might actually understand a joke or the cultural reference that you're making. So again, it's one thing that might be putting too much cognitive overload on someone, and that's not something that you want to achieve with your slides. So the main place I still go for my photos is Flickr, specifically their Creative Commons search. It basically means that you can easily search for images with specific licenses. So it makes it easier to know whether or not you can use them. The other place I go to is Pexels. They have a huge collection of free-to-use stock images. So again, while they can be quite pretty, again, the main thing to keep in mind here is do make sure that they're relevant. If they're not, it's better to just use an abstract background or just a solid color. So don't use photos for the sake of using photos. Use them when they are actually relevant. I mentioned again these design bundles, because again, they're really good resources for finding images as well. And some of these bundles will give you a ton of different backgrounds and interesting images to use. So the easiest way to use photos is to use them to completely fill up the slide and then pair it in some way with text over it. Just to compare, you can see that if you use the smaller image, it just doesn't have as much emotional impact. So the image in this way actually makes it much more distracting. So by using the image as the background, you're driving the point home much, much more. And if you use the right image, the audience will have a much more visceral reaction and make that slide more memorable. So play around and experiment with different photos and with different fonts, because changing either can make a slide feel quite different. So keep in mind though that not every photo will really work as a background. Even though this is a really adorable photo of a kitten, it isn't really that easy to read the text. So if you really want to use that photo though, look at using masks to turn the photo into a specific shape or size. It makes the image just stand out slightly more, and it looks less like you've just plunked the photo into your presentation. Also, if you end up using the same type of mask over and over again, it makes your entire deck feel more coherent and consistent. Next is icons. So the easiest resource for grabbing icons is the Noun project. So this website features a ton of royalty-free icons of all different topics, and you're bound to find icons in there that you can use. Again, I'm mentioning design bundles just because that's where most of my icons from this presentation comes from. And icons work as nice little highlights to cement the text that you're already showing. So it's a lot less distracting than photos, but it's enough of a memory cue that it will help people recall information. So the third way of adding visuals is using shapes. Now, with shapes, I mean, use the shapes that are built into your editors. So you can make lines, triangles, circles, squares, stuff like that. And you can achieve quite a lot when you start combining them to create interesting visuals for your slides. So one example is just to create simple pie charts. It makes the stack just jump out a bit more. And looking behind the scenes, this is built up quite easily. It has two elements, a circle with a yellow circle with a blue square on top of it that has the same color as the background. So once you get the hang of shapes, you can start constructing much more interesting slides. So building diagrams that are much clearer than relying on text alone. So this, for instance, is much more visceral and memorable than just having a simple list. So think about what are the types of visualizations that you can create within your slides rather than copy and pasting images from outside. Build it within your editors. And finally, if you combine shapes with fonts and photos, you can really start making your slides look more unique and give them more personality. Final way to add visuals is animations. So before showing some examples, I again need to remind you not to misuse animations. So most presentation editors support a lot of different animations, and quite frankly, most of them, like the one that you just saw, are super distracting. So if you use animations, try to make sure the animation that you're using makes sense for the purpose of the slide. If it's distracting, make sure the benefits of using it outweigh the downsides. So one of the most powerful animations within Keynote is Magic Move. I think a similar thing exists in PowerPoint nowadays as well, but I don't actually know what it's called. But I think it's also possible. So in this, you basically grab an element. So this can be a shape, a font, a photo. Then you copy it to the next slide and change it in some way. So like make it bigger or move it to a different position. And then Keynote will just automatically figure out what your animation should be. So you basically end up like something like this. So you can use it to very quickly move things around and give some movement to them. So I mainly like to use animations in places where by using them, you're making it easier for the audience to grasp some idea or concept. For instance, in timelines. So you're using the movement to create this illusion of a timeline, basically making it easier for your audience to understand. So those are 4 ways that you can add visuals to your slides. So using both text and images means that your audience will be able to grasp your ideas and concepts much quicker and remember them more. So the final principle is be consistent. So when we hear consistent, I think some people interpret that as, let's make everything look the same. I'll use the same background and the same font for every single slide. And that's not really what I mean here. In design, consistency is defined like this. The usability of a system is improved when similar parts are expressed in similar ways. So when we're talking about consistency in slide design, it's about making sure that those slides that are similar look and feel the same way. Not necessarily that all the slides look and feel the same way. And I think slides are similar if they have a similar purpose. So, bit of a mouthful, but use consistent designs for slides with the same purpose. So this is all about identifying your slide patterns, I guess. So what are the types of slides within your presentation? And then make sure that they follow those same patterns. So I'll use this presentation as an example because, you know, for the past 30 minutes, you've all been exposed already to some of these patterns. So this presentation had the kind of heading slides. So they're bright and yellow to stand out. And those are each time announcing kind of what the different principles are. We had then had our design theory slides, so darker blue background with a different font each time on that. Then we have our example slides, which are white with an example of something on it. And then all the other slides, which follow the basic design of white and yellow text on a lighter blue background, with some variations of what is displayed on them. So the handy thing of breaking it down like this, it means that for future presentations, you have much more tangible building blocks to use. And as you do more and more presentations, you end up building up your own library of kind of patterns that work for your slides. And it becomes easier and quicker to put slides together. Even the main thing though of this is that you're breaking down your presentation into different building blocks and making it easier for your audience to understand, even though they might not consciously pick up on it. It makes it easier for your audience to understand what the different parts of your presentation are. So identify your slide patterns. So those are 4 principles of slide design. So to recap, maximize signal, minimize noise, make important information stand out, show and tell, and be consistent. So I hope that applying these, you'll make it easier for your audience to consume the information that you're presenting and create more effective and beautiful presentations. So if you had told me 10 years ago that nowadays I would enjoy doing talks like this, I really wouldn't have believed you. So at the time, I assumed that to give a good presentation, I would need to focus a lot on me. So making sure that what I say is good and correct, making sure that I don't make a fool of myself, making sure that I don't, I guess. In reality though, the me part of it isn't really that important. Good presentations are all about the audience. So it's your job as a presenter to make sure that you teach, inspire, and motivate your audience. So I'll leave you with this single quote. There's not much point in spinning a yarn if your audience keeps losing the thread. So thanks for listening, everyone.